Fluently speaking. Hello, my dear friends. Today I'm sharing my story of fluently speaking in English. Many of us understand English, but we struggle when it comes to speaking confidently and fluently. This is something that can cause frustration, especially if we want to connect with others, succeed at work, or even express ourselves better. In this story, I'll share how I, a boy who once struggled, managed to overcome my hesitation, develop fluency, and speak English naturally. I hope this story is simple and clear for everyone to understand. Let's begin. Hi, my name is Alex, and today I want to share my journey of speaking English fluently. Speaking English wasn't always easy for me. In fact, just a couple of years ago, I could hardly get a full sentence out without stopping, hesitating, or second-guessing myself. I knew what I wanted to say in my head, but it just wouldn't come out right. Sometimes I'd even avoid speaking English altogether because I was afraid I'd make a mistake. But over time, I learned a few things that helped me become more confident and fluent. It all started when I decided to take fluency seriously. I didn't just want to understand English, I wanted to speak it, clearly, smoothly, and without hesitation. The first thing I realized was that speaking a language is a skill, and like any skill, you have to practice it over and over again to improve. I remember the first time I tried to speak English for more than 5 minutes straight. It was an uncomfortable experience. My mind was racing, trying to find the right words, while my mouth seemed to stumble over everything. I could see the expressions on people's faces as they tried to be patient with me, and that made me even more nervous. But instead of letting that stop me, I decided that I wouldn't give up. If I could just keep practicing, I knew I'd get better. The next step in my journey was finding people to practice with. I realized that speaking to myself wasn't enough. I needed real conversations with real people. I started small. I'd speak to my family in English, even though they didn't always understand everything. Sometimes I'd talk to my friends who were also learning, and we'd help each other out. At first it felt awkward, but over time I noticed something. The more I practiced, the easier it became. I wasn't thinking so much about each word, and sentences started flowing naturally. But I knew this wasn't enough to become truly fluent. So I took it to the next level. I started having conversations with strangers. That was one of the biggest challenges. It wasn't easy at first. There were moments where I felt embarrassed, especially when I stumbled over a word or used the wrong tense. But I learned that mistakes were part of the process. Every mistake taught me something new, and instead of focusing on perfection, I focused on communicating. One day, I decided to set a new goal, speaking English with people I didn't know for at least 10 minutes a day. It was scary, but it changed everything for me. I'd go to the park, a cafe, or anywhere where I could find someone to talk to. Sometimes the conversations were short, and other times they lasted longer than expected. But what mattered was that I was speaking. I was using the language. And you know what happened? Little by little, my confidence grew. I no longer feared making mistakes. I learned to enjoy the process of conversation, even when things didn't go perfectly. The more I spoke, the better I got. And soon I found that I was speaking more fluently than ever before. One of the biggest lessons I learned was that fluency doesn't mean perfection. It's about being able to express yourself naturally, even when you don't know every single word. If you can keep a conversation going, that's fluency. It's about not getting stuck or giving up when you're unsure. I practice speaking in a relaxed way, like I was having a normal chat with friends. There were also moments of self-reflection. I realized that I was my own biggest critic. Every time I made a mistake, I'd beat myself up over it. But then I started thinking, what if I looked at mistakes as a good thing? What if every time I made a mistake, I was actually getting better? And that's exactly what I did. I stopped fearing mistakes and started welcoming them as part of my growth. Fluency, I found, is like any other journey. It takes time, effort, and a lot of practice. There were days when I didn't feel like speaking at all, and other days when I felt like I'd never get there. But I kept going, and that's the most important thing I can share with anyone who wants to speak fluently. Don't give up. Keep speaking, keep practicing, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. In fact, one of my favorite memories of learning to speak fluently was when I had a conversation with someone who didn't speak my native language at all. We spoke in English for over half an hour, and it wasn't until after the conversation ended that I realized how far I'd come. I wasn't translating in my head anymore. I was just speaking, reacting, and enjoying the conversation. Another helpful strategy that worked for me was immersion. I surrounded myself with English. I watched movies, listened to podcasts, and even set my phone and computer to English. This constant exposure helped me become more comfortable with the language. I started thinking in English, which made speaking it so much easier. By the time I realized it, I wasn't just speaking English fluently. I was enjoying it. Speaking in English became a part of my everyday life. Whether I was chatting with friends, giving directions to a tourist, or even answering questions in school, I felt more comfortable and confident. As I continued my journey toward fluency, I found myself picking up new techniques along the way. One thing that really helped me was shadowing. I'd listen to native speakers talk, whether it was in movies, podcasts, or interviews, and I'd repeat what they said right after them. It's almost like copying them in real time, which forced me to match their speed and pronunciation. At first, it was tough. Keeping up with their pace felt like running a race, but it pushed me to speak more naturally. Over time, I could feel my own speaking speed improve, and my confidence in pronunciation grew stronger too. One day, I remember trying this shadowing technique while watching a TV show I loved. The characters were having this fast-paced conversation, and instead of just sitting there and passively watching, I joined in. I mimicked their words, their tone, and their expressions. By the end of the episode, I felt like I had just been part of a real conversation. It was a small victory for me, but it made a big difference in how I approached learning. Another thing that helped was thinking in English. You see, up until that point, I used to think in my native language and then translate it into English. It was like I had two voices in my head, and it made speaking feel slow and clunky. But then I decided to change that. I started thinking directly in English, even for simple thoughts like I'm hungry or I need to finish my homework. It wasn't easy at first. My brain wanted to switch back to my native language, but I stuck with it. One of the funniest moments during this transition happened when I was at the grocery store. I had made a mental list of all the things I needed in English, and while walking down the aisles, I was saying things like, okay, bread, milk, vegetables. I even caught myself thinking, which aisle is the cereal in English? When I realized what I was doing, I smiled. It felt like my brain was rewiring itself, and English was becoming more natural to me every day. There was another important part of my fluency journey, joining conversations even when I didn't feel ready. I used to think I had to wait until I was 100% confident to join in. But the truth is, if you wait for that moment, you'll never speak. I learned that it's better to dive in, even if you don't feel prepared. That's how you grow. I remember one specific situation that really put me to the test. I was in a group setting where everyone was speaking English, and the conversation was moving fast. I had two choices: sit back and stay quiet, or jump in. My heart was racing, and I could feel that familiar fear creeping in, the one that tells you, what if you mess up? What if they don't understand you? But instead of listening to that voice, I took a deep breath and joined the conversation. At first, I stumbled a bit, but I kept going. By the end of it, I had not only managed to hold my own, but I had also learned a lot just by being part of the conversation. That moment taught me that fluency isn't about perfection, it's about communication. If you can get your message across even if you make a few mistakes, that's what matters. People aren't going to judge you as harshly as you think. Most of the time, they're just happy you're trying. One of the most rewarding experiences came when I traveled abroad for the first time. It was a school trip, and we were visiting a country where English was the main language spoken. I was excited but nervous at the same time. I knew this would be the ultimate test of everything I'd been practicing. When we landed and stepped off the plane, I heard English all around me. At that moment, something clicked. Instead of feeling anxious, I felt ready. During the trip, I had to interact with people everywhere, at restaurants, at the hotel, when asking for directions. And every time, I could feel my fluency growing. I wasn't translating in my head anymore, and I didn't feel the pressure I once did. I just spoke. Sure, there were still moments where I hesitated or couldn't find the right word, but I didn't let it stop me. I realized that fluency is about being able to keep the conversation going, even if things don't go perfectly. One night during the trip, I had a long conversation with a local shop owner. We talked about everything, from where I was from to what I thought about his city to his experiences growing up. It was such a natural, flowing conversation that I didn't even realize how much time had passed. When I walked out of that shop, I had this overwhelming sense of accomplishment. I had just held a long conversation in English without even thinking about it. It felt like a breakthrough. After that, I didn't see fluency as this unreachable goal anymore. I knew it was something I could do, and that realization changed everything for me. When I got back home from the trip, I continued practicing every day. I'd find new ways to challenge myself, whether it was talking to strangers, joining online language groups, or even just reading books out loud. The more I spoke, the more natural it became, and soon I found myself helping others who were going through the same struggles I once had. I started volunteering at a local language exchange program. There were people from all over the world, and we'd meet up to practice speaking different languages. I noticed that many of them had the same fears I used to have: fear of making mistakes, fear of sounding awkward, fear of not being understood. But I would tell them what I had learned. You don't have to be perfect to be fluent. You just have to keep speaking. Over time, I became not just a learner, but also a mentor. I helped others build their confidence, and in doing so, I reinforced my own. Every time I saw someone break through their fear and start speaking more fluently, it reminded me of my own journey, and it felt great to know that I could help someone else along the way. My journey toward fluency didn't stop with small conversations at home or volunteering at local language exchange programs. The next big step came when I decided to take my fluency to a new level. It all started when I got an exciting opportunity to visit a new country. This was different from my school trip. It was going to be a longer stay, and I'd have to rely solely on English to communicate. At first, the idea was thrilling but also nerve-wracking. I knew this was going to be a huge test for my English fluency. The thought of being in a new environment, surrounded by native speakers, both excited and scared me. But deep down, I also knew that this was the perfect chance to push myself and see just how far I had come. The moment I landed in the new country, I could feel the energy in the air. Everything around me was unfamiliar. The signs, the accents, the rhythm of speech, but it all gave me a sense of freedom too. It was like a clean slate where I could be whoever I wanted, speak however I wanted, and not feel the pressure of being perfect. I knew that this was my chance to immerse myself fully in English, and I wasn't going to let fear hold me back. From day one, I made it my mission to speak English as much as possible. I didn't just want to get by, I wanted to really engage with the people around me. Whether it was at the grocery store, the bus stop, or even while ordering food at a restaurant, I made sure to start conversations. Every interaction, no matter how small, became a learning experience. I'll never forget my first real conversation there. I was in a coffee shop, and the barista asked me how I was enjoying my visit so far. For a split second, I hesitated, wondering if my words would come out right. But then I remembered all the practice I had put in, all the shadowing, the thinking in English, and the conversations with strangers back home. So I smiled and told her about my experience so far, the places I had seen, the food I had tried, and how exciting everything felt. As we chatted, I realized that I wasn't thinking about the grammar or the vocabulary. I was just talking. It felt natural, like the conversations I'd been practicing for so long. The more I spoke, the more comfortable I became. It was like all those months of hard work had finally paid off, and now I was reaping the rewards. My conversations flowed more easily, and I started picking up on the little nuances of the language. Things like local expressions, slang, and even the rhythm of how people spoke. It wasn't just about using the right words anymore. It was about fitting into the way English was used in everyday life. There was one particularly memorable moment when I was at a local market. I was trying to buy some fruits and vegetables, and I struck up a conversation with the vendor. He was an older man with a thick local accent, and at first I found it a bit challenging to understand everything he was saying. But instead of panicking or asking him to repeat himself multiple times, I listened carefully, picked up on the key words, and responded as best as I could. Before I knew it, we were laughing and joking about the different fruits in the market. He even taught me a few local phrases that people used around there. That experience taught me something important. Fluency isn't just about understanding every single word. It's about being able to adapt, to keep the conversation going even when you don't know every detail. It's about being present in the moment and focusing on the connection you're building with the other person, rather than getting stuck on the mechanics of language. The longer I stayed in the country, the more I realized that fluency also comes from cultural immersion. I wasn't just learning how to speak English better, I was learning how to understand the culture behind it. I started attending local events, meeting new people, and immersing myself in the daily life of the place. The more I interacted with people, the more I began to pick up on the subtle things, like how to make small talk, how to express certain emotions, and even how humor worked in conversations. One evening, I was invited to a family dinner by a friend I had made during my stay. It was a big gathering, with lots of food, laughter, and of course, conversation. At first, I felt a little out of place. not knowing everyone, but then I remembered how far I had come. I jumped into the conversation, joining in on the stories, sharing my own experiences, and laughing along with everyone. By the end of the night, I had made new friends, and I realized that I had been speaking English for hours without even thinking about it. The trip wasn't without its challenges, though. There were still moments when I struggled, whether it was understanding a particularly fast speaker or finding the right words in a complex discussion. But instead of letting those moments discourage me, I used them as motivation. Each challenge was a reminder that there was always more to learn, and that's what made the journey exciting. I didn't aim for perfection anymore. I aimed for progress. One day, as I was walking through a park, I met a fellow traveler who was also learning English. He was nervous, just like I had been at the start of my journey, and we began talking about the challenges of becoming fluent. He asked me how I had become so confident in speaking, and I found myself telling him the same things I had learned over the years: to speak as much as possible, to make mistakes without fear, and to immerse himself in the language. It was in that moment that I realized how far I had come. I wasn't just a learner anymore. I was someone who could guide others on their own journey. As the days passed, I grew more and more comfortable in this new country, speaking English every day. It felt like my second nature now, and I no longer had the constant voice in my head worrying about mistakes. I had reached a point where I could truly enjoy conversations, laugh at jokes, and express my thoughts without hesitation. By the time my stay in the country came to an end, I knew that this experience had changed me. Not only had I improved my fluency, but I had also grown as a person. I had stepped out of my comfort zone, embraced new challenges, and come out stronger on the other side. Speaking English fluently had become not just a skill, but a part of who I was. When I returned home, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. I had proven to myself that I could thrive in an English-speaking environment, and that gave me even more confidence moving forward. My journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more opportunities to practice. But I had reached a place where I could speak fluently, naturally, and most importantly, with joy. Returning home from that life-changing trip didn't mean that my fluency journey ended. In fact, it was just another stepping stone. I had tasted what it felt like to live and communicate fluently in English, and I wanted to keep that momentum going. So, back home, I made sure to stay connected with the language. One of the first things I did was to stay in touch with the people I had met during my trip. Through video calls, messaging apps, and emails, I kept practicing. These conversations weren't as spontaneous as face-to-face interactions, but they helped me keep my fluency sharp. Sometimes I'd even surprise myself with how effortlessly the words flowed. I was no longer thinking about English. I was simply speaking it. But more than that, my mindset had shifted. I now approached every interaction with the same sense of confidence that I had gained abroad. Whether I was talking to someone in a language exchange program or chatting with a native speaker online, I felt like I belonged in those conversations. English had become a part of my daily life, not just something I practiced for the sake of improving. One day, I met up with some friends back home who had also been working on their English. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and they were curious about my trip. I remember feeling excited as I told them all about my experiences, from the market conversations to the family dinner and everything in between. They were impressed by how naturally I spoke, and they asked me how I managed to improve so much in such a short time. That's when it hit me. My progress hadn't been as fast as it seemed. Sure, the trip had accelerated my fluency, but the foundation had been laid long before that. All the shadowing exercises, the thinking in English, the small conversations I had forced myself into, they had all been building blocks. The trip was just the culmination of everything I had been working toward, and I realized that anyone could achieve the same level of fluency with enough persistence. I shared this with my friends, encouraging them to find ways to immerse themselves in English, even if they couldn't travel to an English-speaking country. I told them how much daily practice mattered and how speaking, even when you felt unprepared, was the key. One of my friends asked if I could help him with his speaking skills, and I gladly agreed. We started meeting regularly to practice. At first, it felt a bit like teaching, but I soon realized that I was learning just as much as he was. Explaining how to improve fluency made me reflect on my own journey. I'd tell him things like, "Don't be afraid of making mistakes," and "Focus on communication, not perfection," which were lessons I had learned myself. Through these practice sessions, I noticed something interesting. My fluency was improving even more. It wasn't just about the technical aspects of speaking anymore, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation. It was about developing a feel for the language. The more I spoke, the more I understood the flow of conversations, the rhythm of sentences, and how to express myself in ways that sounded natural. It was like I was fine-tuning my English skills, going from being fluent to feeling truly comfortable in the language. One day, after one of our practice sessions, my friend and I were having a casual conversation. We weren't focusing on any specific exercises, just chatting about our daily lives. At some point, I realized we had been speaking English the whole time without even thinking about it. It was such a normal, natural conversation that we had forgotten we were practicing. That moment made me smile, because I knew that both of us had reached a new level of comfort with the language. In the months that followed, I continued to explore different ways to stay engaged with English. I watched movies and shows without subtitles. I read books in English, and I even started writing short stories. This helped me to expand my vocabulary and get more creative with how I expressed myself. I also made sure to keep up with my language exchange group. Speaking with people from different countries allowed me to experience different English accents and perspectives, which was a great way to keep my listening skills sharp. Then, something unexpected happened. I was invited to speak at a local event where people were sharing their language learning experiences. They wanted me to talk about how I had learned English and what tips I could offer to others. At first, I wasn't sure if I was ready to speak in front of a crowd. Sure, I was fluent, but this was a formal event. What if I made mistakes in front of everyone? But then I thought back to everything I had learned. Fluency isn't about perfection. It's about communication and connection. So, I decided to say yes. The day of the event arrived, and I found myself standing in front of a room full of people, all eager to hear my story. I started with the same message I had shared with you earlier. Hello, my dear friends. Today, I'm sharing my story about learning to speak English fluently. I walked them through my journey, the struggles, the breakthroughs, the trip to the new country, and everything in between. I shared tips like shadowing, thinking in English, and practicing with native speakers. I told them that the key was to keep speaking, even when it felt difficult. As I spoke, I realized that I wasn't nervous anymore. The words came naturally, and the audience was engaged. They nodded along as I spoke, and I could see that my story was resonating with them. When I finished, I received applause, and several people came up to me afterward to thank me for the tips and to share their own language learning stories. That experience was a turning point for me. I had not only become fluent in English, but also confident enough to speak in front of others, to share my knowledge and help others on their journey. It was a full circle moment, a reminder of how far I had come. And now, looking back, I realize that my fluency journey never truly ends. There's always more to learn, more conversations to have, and more experiences to gain. But I've reached a point where I can enjoy every step of the process. I speak English fluently now, and that's something I'm proud of. But the most important lesson I've learned is that fluency isn't a destination, it's a journey. It's about enjoying the process of learning and speaking, and it's about connecting with others along the way. The day of the event arrived, and I found myself standing in front of a room full of people, all eager to hear my story. I started with the same message I had shared with you earlier. Hello, my dear friends. Today, I'm sharing my story about learning to speak English fluently. I walked them through my journey, the struggles, the breakthroughs, the trip to the new country, and everything in between. I shared tips like shadowing, thinking in English, and practicing with native speakers. I told them that the key was to keep speaking, even when it felt difficult. As I spoke, I realized that I wasn't nervous anymore. The words came naturally, and the audience was engaged. They nodded along as I spoke, and I could see that my story was resonating with them. When I finished, I received applause, and several people came up to me afterward to thank me for the tips and to share their own language learning stories. That experience was a turning point for me. I had not only become fluent in English, but also confident enough to speak in front of others, to share my knowledge and help others on their journey. It was a full circle moment, a reminder of how far I had come. And now, looking back, I realize that my fluency journey never truly ends. There's always more to learn, more conversations to have, and more experiences to gain. But I've reached a point where I can enjoy every step of the process. I speak English fluently now, and that's something I'm proud of. But the most important lesson I've learned is that fluency isn't a destination, it's a journey. It's about enjoying the process of learning and speaking, and it's about connecting with others along the way.
Tip: join language exchange groups, either in person or online, and practice regularly. Don't worry about perfection, just communicate. 2. Shadowing. Imitate native speakers. Shadowing is a technique where you listen to a native speaker and try to repeat what they say as closely as possible, imitating their intonation, pronunciation, and rhythm. It's like playing a game of copycat, but with a purpose. This technique helped me a lot, especially with pronunciation and fluency. I'd watch videos or listen to podcasts, pause after each sentence, and repeat it exactly as the speaker did. Over time, I noticed that my speech started to sound more natural, and I could mimic the flow of real conversations. How to start shadowing. Pick a short video, podcast, or TV show clip with native speakers. Listen carefully to how they speak, including their tone and pauses. Pause after each sentence and repeat what they said, trying to match their accent and pace. Do this regularly for about 10 to 15 minutes a day. 3. Think in English. One of the biggest shifts for me was when I started thinking in English. Before that, I'd always translate sentences in my head from my native language to English, which slowed me down and made speaking feel clunky. But when you start thinking directly in English, your speech becomes more fluid and natural. Here's how you can practice thinking in English. Describe your day in English. While going about your day, think about what you're doing in English. For example, if you're making breakfast, Say to yourself, I'm making toast and eggs. Talk to yourself. Yes, it might sound a bit strange, but talking to yourself in English is a great way to practice forming sentences and expressing thoughts without any pressure. Inner conversations. When you're by yourself, have imaginary conversations in English. Pretend you're explaining something to a friend or describing a movie you watched. This helps build your fluency because you're practicing forming thoughts directly in English. 4. Listen to a variety of English sources. Fluency isn't just about speaking, it's also about understanding different accents, vocabulary, and styles of communication. Listening to a variety of English speakers will expose you to different ways of speaking and help you adapt to real-world conversations. I listen to podcasts, watch TV shows, YouTube videos, and even news channels in English. This helped me get used to different accents and tones. For example, British English sounds different from American English, and listening to both helps you develop a wider understanding. Tip: don't just stick to one type of content. Mix it up. Listen to interviews, TED Talks, podcasts, movies, and news broadcasts. This will keep things interesting and help you understand a wide range of conversational styles. 5. Focus on communication, not perfection. One of the biggest hurdles to fluency is the fear of making mistakes. Trust me, I know how this feels. But here's the truth. Communication is more important than speaking perfectly. When you're in a conversation, the goal is to get your message across, not to impress someone with perfect grammar. Most native speakers won't even notice small grammar mistakes if you're speaking confidently. Plus, when you focus on communication, you're more likely to relax and enjoy the conversation, which is key to fluency. Tip: don't overthink every word or phrase. Focus on the flow of the conversation and make sure you're understood. Fluency comes from practice and engagement, not from being perfect. 6. Use English in your daily life. If you want to become fluent, English has to be part of your daily life. This doesn't mean spending hours every day studying grammar books. Instead, incorporate English into activities you already enjoy. Watch movies, TV shows in English. Turn off the subtitles and challenge yourself to understand as much as possible. If it's too difficult, start with shows you've already seen in your own language. Read books, chat or articles in English. Start with books or articles that match your current level and gradually move to more complex material. Write in English. Keeping a journal in English is a great way to practice forming sentences and organizing your thoughts. Change your phone, computer language to English. This forces you to engage with English in a practical way every day. The more English is integrated into your life, the faster you'll improve. 7. Surround yourself with English speakers. If possible, surround yourself with English speakers, either online or in person. Immersing yourself in an English-speaking environment is one of the most effective ways to improve fluency. This is exactly what happened when I traveled to a new country, and it made a huge difference. If traveling isn't an option, you can still immerse yourself by joining online communities, attending local language meetups, or finding English-speaking friends.
The key is to put yourself in situations where you have no choice but to speak English. Tip: language exchange apps like HelloTalk, Tandem, or Meetup can connect you with English speakers from around the world. Engage in conversations regularly. 8. Stay consistent and patient. Finally, the most important tip, be patient and stay consistent. Fluency doesn't happen overnight, and there will be times when it feels like you're not making any progress. But trust me, if you keep practicing and speaking regularly, you will see results. If possible, record yourself and compare your reading with how native speakers pronounce the same words. Don't rush. Take your time and focus on clarity and flow. This technique helps build confidence in speaking and improves your overall fluency because it mimics real speech patterns. 13. Use English in real-life situations. One of the best ways to improve your fluency is to use English in practical, real-life situations. Even if you're not living in an English-speaking country, you can still create opportunities to use English in daily life. For example, order food in English. Many restaurants and cafes in big cities have staff who speak English, so try ordering your meal in English when you can. Ask for directions. If you're traveling, ask for directions or information in English, even if you're in a non-English speaking country. Many people can respond to you in English. Speak with customer service in English. If you're calling a customer service line that offers English support, switch to the English option and practice speaking with a representative. Real-life interactions force you to think on your feet and use your English in more spontaneous ways. The more you practice these situations, the more fluent you'll be. Set realistic goals for yourself, like practicing speaking for 10 to 15 minutes a day and stick to them. Celebrate small victories like having your first conversation without hesitating or understanding a new accent. These moments are signs that you're improving, even if it doesn't always feel that way. Practice. Speaking out loud, even when you're alone. This tip is so simple yet so effective. Speak out loud even when no one is around to listen. You can practice fluency by having mini monologues about your day, thoughts, or plans. This is something I often did, especially when I couldn't find someone to practice with. For example, after waking up, I'd walk through my daily routine out loud in English. All right, first, I'm going to brush my teeth, then make some coffee. This might feel a bit odd at first, but it's a great way to get used to hearing yourself speak in English. It helps you become more comfortable with the language, and over time, it helps you express thoughts without overthinking. Tip: start with small daily activities, then work up to narrating more complex ideas, like talking about your plans for the weekend or explaining something you've recently learned. 10. Record yourself. Speaking. Recording yourself while speaking in English is a powerful way to track your progress and identify areas for improvement. When I started recording myself, I noticed mistakes I didn't catch while I was speaking. Plus, I could hear my progress over time, which was really motivating. Here's what I recommend. Pick a topic you're comfortable with, like a hobby or a recent event. Record yourself talking about that topic for a few minutes. Listen back to your recording and make notes on areas you want to improve, whether it's pronunciation, pacing, or clarity. Do this regularly, and you'll see noticeable improvements in your fluency and confidence. 11. Don't just learn words. Learn phrases. When I was just starting out, I focused a lot on learning individual vocabulary words, which helped my reading and understanding. But when it came to speaking fluently, I realized that learning whole phrases and expressions was much more useful. Native speakers don't think about individual words. They think in chunks of language. For example, Instead of memorizing the word coffee, learn the whole phrase, "Would you like to grab a coffee?" Or, "Let's meet for coffee tomorrow." Learning set phrases will help you respond quickly and naturally in conversations without having to build sentences from scratch. Tip: collect common expressions and phrases, then practice using them in different situations. You'll soon find yourself speaking more fluidly because you won't have to pause and think about the structure of your sentences. 12. Read aloud to improve pronunciation and rhythm. Reading out loud is one of the best ways to improve your pronunciation, intonation, and overall fluency. When I started doing this, I noticed that my speech became more natural and I could mimic the flow of native speakers much better. Here's how to practice reading aloud. Choose a book, article, or story that you enjoy. Read a few sentences out loud, focusing on your pronunciation and the rhythm of your speech.